If you look around, you'll see that crosses are all around us. On church steeples, around people's necks, on hot cross buns, and those WWJD, what would Jesus do, bracelets. And this is not new. The cross and various other cruciforms or cross-like images have long been used by various cultures and religions as symbols of life. For some, the cross might depict the four corners of the earth, the four elements of creation, the four beasts in a scheme of the zodiac, the four solstices and equinoxes, or the four winds that bring rain. Ancient Egypt used the cross as a symbol of eternal life, and much New Age religion has popularized the image of a cross tree, with each corner representing one season of the tree's annual cycle. In all these examples, the cross is a symbol of the life of nature or community. But try telling that to Roman-occupied Israel. To them, the cross was anything but life-giving. Too many of them had seen friends and loved ones murdered on them. Too many of them had encountered forests of crosses, terrible reminders to anyone who broke Roman law. From stealing to murder, the punishment was the same. They had to keep these rebellious Israelite peasants in line somehow. And that's why the crowds cheered when Jesus arrived in the holy city. Finally, someone was going to come stop the cruelty. Finally, someone was going to throw the Romans out. Finally, someone will bring Israel back to its former glory, a glory not seen since King David ruled so many centuries ago. And they pinned all their hopes on this poor backwoods preacher. He could heal people. Maybe he could heal the political sickness that kept God's people from inheriting their destiny. He could cast out demons. Maybe he could cast out the demonic tyranny of these Roman oppressors. He could raise the dead. Maybe he could raise the people to reclaim their rights to citizenship as God's chosen people, a light to the nations. But when they saw Jesus in handcuffs, they started asking questions. When he wouldn't speak up for himself, they grumbled amongst each other. If he wouldn't defend himself, then he wouldn't defend them. If he wouldn't rescue himself, he couldn't save them. So when they realized he wasn't going to be the liberator they thought they hoped, they turned against him, demanded that the government kill him, and then they watched him die. The cross was saved for the lowest class of people. The Romans knew that it was the most painful and horrific form of torture and death. The victim could hang there for days. But if the victim took too long to die, their legs would be broken so that they couldn't support themselves, and they would slowly suffocate. And when the Romans got bored, they crucified their victims upside down while their families watched in agony. As I said, for these people, the cross was anything but life-giving. The early Christians didn't like the imagery of the cross much either. They didn't use it in worship and art until centuries after its actual use had declined. The cross for them was still so raw, still an instrument of death. Because even if the cross was empty, it was still waiting in deathly silence for its next victim, like an empty hangman's noose or an unoccupied electric chair. If Jesus was pictured on it, his tortured body was a reminder of his agony, not his resurrection, and not our salvation. They used the cross to retell Jesus' story because they knew in their bones that Jesus' story had become their story and their story had become his. The cross was the intersection of the human and the divine. They couldn't beautify the cross, the torture of the cross, and they didn't picture it. But they also knew something had happened in those holy days that forever transformed their lives. And not just them, us too. We know this because his story and our story have been woven together in a strange tapestry. Stories that collide with this story that we gathered here today, to remember how God entered our story in Jesus and how we entered God's story through Christ. Because in Jesus, God has entered our story when it looks like our story might not have unfolded the way we wanted. When life and circumstance take the arc of our lives in a direction we didn't expect or certainly didn't want. When dreams crumble under the weight of family expectations or social obligations. When you look at your life and you know that you're capable of so much more. When you read the news and you wonder if human greed will lead to the collapse of the system that's sustaining it, and you can't believe that no one else can see it. When the doctor enters the examining room and the look on her face tells you that the news isn't good. When you look across the table and you wonder who this stranger is that you've been married to all these years. When you find yourself across the desk from a funeral director, saying goodbye to someone who has gone too soon, and everyone has gone too soon. When you can feel your own life draining from you, and you're terrified that when you close your eyes in death, that you will never open them again, despite the promises of everlasting life you've heard since you were a child. Today, those stories become God's stories. They're interwoven together so that our stories and God's great big story of creation and life are tied together, and that the ending to our story will change, and that the strand that ties these two stories together is Jesus. Because that day on the cross, it was Jesus who wasn't just standing up to the destructive powers of the world. Jesus wasn't just confronting the forces that defy God's vision for the world. That day, on the cross, Jesus was standing up to God on our behalf. Jesus was showing God what it means to be in pain. That day on the cross, Jesus was showing God the frustrations of limitations, the terror of mortality, the outrage of injustice, the agony of brokenness, the violence of sin, the anguish of estrangement, the ruin of disease, the alienation of isolation, the sadness of separation, and the threat of oblivion. In Jesus, God learned what it means to be human, and God was exposed to the world that human beings live with. It was from Jesus' view on the cross that God saw how easy it can be to ruin our world, how easy it can be that countries invade each other just to enlarge their territory, or massive disparity between rich and poor can be justified or even celebrated, how disease can almost destroy entire continents while the rest of the world shrugs its shoulder. It was from Jesus' view on the cross that God saw how easy it can be for suicide bombers to kill innocent people in airports and coffee shops. How people can discriminate against each other simply because they are different. How pride can destroy lifelong friendships. How the human impulse to self-protection can overpower the human longing for love. In Jesus, God knows what it's like to be absolutely helpless and hopeless. In Jesus, God learned what your life is like. In Jesus, God learned what the world is like, not from some faraway heaven where God looks down at us from a safe distance, observing us, but from the very heart of the world's suffering. In his book, Silence, the Japanese writer Shisako Endo tells the story of a 17th century Portuguese missionary named Rodriguez who goes to Japan to save souls. Preparing himself for this mission, he spends a great deal of time in prayer and in contemplating the face of Christ, in which he sees every quality he himself wishes to possess: courage, serenity, wisdom, faith. It's an altogether noble image, only it reminds just that for Rodriguez, a silent image that does not offer him guidance or consolation. When he arrives in Japan, he is quickly in need of both. walking right into a national uprising against Christians. He soon finds himself in prison, where his captors order him to renounce his faith. And sustained by the brave faith of the courageous Christ, he refuses, hoping to be martyred on the spot. Instead, he is returned to his cell, where he listens for some word from the Lord. But all he hears are the cries of his fellow prisoners and a strange snuffling sound he assumes is the snoring of the guards. When he is yanked from his cell again the next morning and refuses once again to renounce his faith, he learns that the strange snuffling sound he heard in the dark is the labored breathing of Japanese Christians. They have been crucified upside down, their heads half buried in pits of excrement. They will hang there like that, the guards tell him, until he renounces his faith. Rodriguez is paralyzed. Who should he betray? Shall he betray Christ or the fellow Christians? That is his choice. If he chooses Christ, he leaves his fellow Christians in unimaginable suffering. If he chooses the Christians, he turns his back on Christ and just may lose his soul. And while he agonizes over the decision, the guards bring in a metal image of Christ into the room and place it at Rodriguez's feet. They tell him to trample on it, to put his foot in the middle of the Christ image and to grind it with his toe. Looking down at it, Rodriguez sees that it is already crushed and soiled by the feet of those who have gone before him. It bears no resemblance to the face he has adored all his life, the brave, serene, wise, yet silent face to whom he has prayed his desperate prayers. Torn between his loyalty to Christ and his loyalty to those snuffling in the dark, he is hung between the two when he hears the voice of Christ coming to him from the image at his feet. Trample. Trample. I, more than anyone, know the pain at your foot. So trample. It was to be trampled on that I was born into this world. Christ speaks not from some safe place outside of human suffering, but from its very heart. Christ speaks not from the heavenly realms, but from the deepest pit of the worldly pain. Christ speaks not from clouds, but from the cross. Because that day when God was the victim of the worst of human impulses, that day when the majesty of the divine endured the lowest limits of human experience, that day when all the sadness, all the grief, all the anger, all the failure, all the hate, all the rage, all the injustice, all the abuse, and all the death were gathered together and nailed into the flesh of Jesus Christ, that God knew what weak, limited human beings experience. So despite all appearances, Jesus did not suffer alone. God suffered with him and in him. Because in Jesus, God was killing the enemy from within. In Jesus, God was killing death. So when Jesus closed his eyes and gave up his ghost, this was no defeat. This was no mockery. This was a triumph. This was a victory. This was a victory for us all, those of us who don't have the strength or the courage to be heroic. This was a victory for those of us who fail. This was a victory for those of us who grieve. This was a victory for those of us who suffer. This was a victory for those of us who die. Because Jesus makes sacred our pain and he hallows our death. He speaks from the heart of God's silence and he cries out on behalf of a suffering world, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then Jesus closes his eyes. He breathes his last. His heart stops and he wins a victory for us all. And today, when we place Jesus in the tomb, we look at our own lives, we look at ourselves, we look at each other, and we look at the world with eyes wide open for the God who destroyed our illusions about who we are and is demanding that we are honest about our vulnerability, recognizing our culpability in human suffering, embracing our weakness, and remembering that we are buried with him in his tomb. Amen.